the pastor of Higher Ground Church of God in Christ here in St. Cloud, Minnesota. I'm getting to know your faces quite well, which is a great thing. And I look forward to being able to see them in person someday. We are in the middle of some trying times, aren't we? And we are doing our very model best to be able to bring forth all of our best in the middle of this. I am very thankful for the Chancellor's comments on today. And I want to actually look at or start us off by just looking at a piece of it that in which he said this is going to be a very difficult period. There's a real possibility of heightened stress, of tension and anxiety, and for some, trauma. Seek support.
Paige, can you put the slide on?
Seek support if you need it. This is the support that we need. And we need each other. In the midst of everything else that we've got going on, what we cannot do is leave each other out. That is one way we're going to doom ourselves into repeating the very things that have already happened. We are not in a bubble. We are not in a world by ourselves. This is not something that affects us alone. But the solution.
The slide about trauma. Sorry, Pastor James.
No, you're fine. So I want to thank you for being here and for giving me an opportunity to be engaged in this with you. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to my friend Kevin. And we're going to go back and forth a couple of different times here. So Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you, Pastor James. And greetings to everybody. My name is Kevin Lanave. I'm a faculty member at the St. Cloud Technical and Community College. As Pastor James indicated, there are some emotional impacts, significant emotional impacts, and impacts on people's spirits that are taking place, even to the extent of trauma. And we really want to be attentive to those kind of feelings and not just do the intellectual academic head thing that we sometimes fall into. Next slide. In the chat, this is one of the resources that's there. There are a couple of others. Next slide. So we're about to enter conversations. Pastor James and I will be sharing for a few minutes, but then we will be turning it over to small group conversations. And the Chancellor said, these aren't easy conversations to have. And sometimes it's hard to know even where to begin. But he described some qualities he really would like us to encourage us to pay attention to. The idea of being safe and inclusive. The idea that our discourse, our conversations with each other have a spirit of civility. That we're open to a rich multiplicity of views and perspectives, and that we're going to engage in these conversations with compassion and with courage. Next slide. Pastor James, any thoughts about this one?
So there is a lot to be said for the larger issues that are at hand. As it's been mentioned already, the death of George Floyd, the COVID pandemic, the recent shooting that has occurred just this week. And we have a whole set or a whole host of things that are going on in our own individual backyards. What we want to make sure that we are doing is being courageous in this moment. And that's exactly what it's going to take. A little bit of walking on water, a little bit of walking with your eyes closed, a little bit of trusting someone that you may not on a normal day have trusted is going to take us a long way in this conversation. Please be courageous. Please be courageous, because courageous is what it's going to take in order for us to navigate this. And we are going to make it, if not through sheer will, we're going to make it through. But those of us who choose to walk courageously will come out of this on the other side with another bond, with another relationship that we may not have had when we started. Next slide.
At the top, you see a quote from the chancellor that the deep wounds evoked in the wake of George Floyd's death and the death of Dante Wright this past weekend, they're stark reminders of what he refers to as systemic injustices that people in the Black community and other people of color have faced through the years. And I want to just talk a little bit about this idea of systemic injustice. You'll notice on the screen, there's something being referred to as interpersonal racial discrimination. And basically what that form of racism means is that somebody is mistreating somebody else because of their race. And when I think about how that happens in educational settings like ours, or in other spaces that I've worked as an educator, I think of things like racial slurs that are sometimes used, about the ways people bully one another emotionally or even physically assault one another. Those would be examples of what I think of when I think of interpersonal forms of racial discrimination. Next slide. But the chancellor is referring to something distinct from that. He's talking about something called systemic racism. And I would define systemic racism in this way. It's when you have an organization or a community or a society that has laws and policies that give people of one race special access to resources and opportunities to improve their lives, but gives people of other racial groups much less and maybe even no access to those resources and opportunities. I've worked in educational systems since the mid-1980s. And when I think about systemic racism in educational institutions, I think about some of these examples, like the curriculum. There are times and there are places, and it was even in my own classroom along the way, where if I thought critically about the curriculum, it was very focused on one racial group. And the other racial groups were kind of invisible, didn't learn much about the culture, didn't learn much about the history. I think about how standardized testing gets used and how schools sometimes say, you know, this is what you need to accomplish on this standardized test in order for us to accept you, to admit you to our college or our high school. And yet studies have shown that certain standardized tests really advantaged one racial group and disadvantaged, marginalized, and even exclude others. And I also think about how we do hiring. Like sometimes I've been in educational institutions where positions were advertised, but when people looked at resumes, they looked at how prestigious is that person's educational background and picked along those lines which advantaged people who had access to those kind of institutions, which more often than not is a specific racial group. Next slide. So when I think about interpersonal racial discrimination, I think about how anybody from any racial group or ethnic group can engage in those kinds of examples. But if I'm really honest, and I think about how things function in the systems in our country, those systems are created and maintained by people who are white. So when I said curriculum gave advantage or standardized testing or hiring gave advantage, they're designed to be supportive of and to advantage people who are white. Next slide.
The chancellor said, let's work together to commit to make meaningful social progress to advance a more equitable, inclusive, and just society. And that is a very succinct, very powerful statement. But then the question arises, how? What are we doing in order to get to the place where we talk about that? And we use a lot of really good academic words, you know, the advance and equitable and just and all of those things. And yet when we use those, and we use them every single time we come across a situation or a circumstance where we're reminded that there's still work to do. And this is a statement that I have come up with myself. Learn. Always learn. And those periods after the end of it are absolutely purposeful. Learn, period. No matter what. Always, no matter what, learn. And you have to make sure that you have an understanding that when we talk about those learns are not just the academic, theoretical, in our headspace learning that we're doing. Learn with your mouth. Learn with your body. Learn with your presence. Learn with your statements. Learn with your engagements. Learn with your friendships. Learn with those individuals and those people that you choose or not choose to engage or to engage with. That every part of you needs and has to be a participant in the learning that you're doing. And the reason why that is so important is because in order for the healing that we are so looking for to happen in the society as a whole, we have to be fully engaged in it. We have to be fully engaged and participant in the action of learning, because ignorance is not a stationary aggressor. Ignorance can capture all of us. If we refuse or if we stop learning, then ignorance will once again encroach upon us. There is no secret level that you can get to, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your experiences, where you can say or come to yourself that I will stop learning because I have now reached a height of enlightenment that says that I no longer have anything else to learn. I no longer have any other place that I need to go. Learn. Always learn. Next slide. There is a light in the world, a healing spirit more powerful than any injustice we may encounter. We sometimes lose sight of this force when there is suffering, too much pain. Then suddenly the light will appear in the lives of ordinary people who hear the call and respond in extraordinary ways. Next slide. What ways are extraordinary? What ways can we respond? When we think about the experiences of Black people, the experiences and the perspectives of people of color are not different than the experiences of people that are not of color. That sounds weird. Of white people, that sounds weird. Everybody else, the experiences are not different. The reactions, they are. Law enforcement, courts, prison, employment, healthcare, housing, schooling. What are your experiences? We are marginalized and oppressed by lots of different things. And really what you want to make sure that you're doing is, if we go back to that learn, always learn, appreciate and understand that the position that you find yourself in is as a result of everything else that you have come to up in your life. And you know that you are here in all of the years that you have put into getting here. There are the same or similar storylines, but there are also storylines that are far different. Even though we find ourselves in this place at this time, in this location, all together, the path that was taken for me to get here is far and away different from what it took for you to get here. And there just needs to be an appreciation for that and a willingness to learn what it took in order to get there. Next slide. Right. We are not helpless and hopeless. We have the capacity for resilience, resistance, and leadership in the process of creating a greater racial justice. And the only thing that I will say about this is that when I say racial justice, I want to make sure that this lands on you the right way. Racial justice in and of itself, when you are talking to people of color, is an oxymoron, because it says racial justice. And justice, if you are a race other than white, is different. There is no equality that is apparent or assumed when you tell me justice. And so while we are working on and working through an understanding of what it means to exist and to be and to live with people of different walks, of different likes, a part of what we want to make sure that we are learning, and a part of what we make sure that we are challenging, is the very understanding that we have of the words that we are using, even when we are using the words to encourage, to empower, and to educate. Next slide.
Thank you, Pastor James. As I thought about what I might say in this presentation, the first thing I wanted to say is those of us who are white, we just really need to listen. Listen so that we broaden and deepen our understanding of what are the experiences of people of color. And it's really important when listening to those experiences to come from a place of openness and compassion, and not be driven solely or primarily by a sense of guilt. Next slide. If we do that, in my experience, I become increasingly uncomfortable. And I don't just mean uncomfortable in the sense of, oh, this chair isn't comfortable, I'm going to go to a different one. I mean like continually, increasingly uncomfortable. And next slide. It's my experience that doing that, going through that discomfort, brings me increasingly into life-giving and community-creating spaces and relationships. Next slide. Something else that challenges me is this whole idea of how does systemic racism works? Because in my experience, I can get the interpersonal prejudice. I know how that operates. I know when I do it. But this systemic piece, like how am I advantaged by these different systems? Next slide. Basically, what systemic racism says is those of us who are white, we're treated differently. And that difference involves significantly greater access to resources and opportunities. It doesn't mean that we're bad people. It just means that we have that kind of access. And doing that kind of work on systemic racism will become increasingly uncomfortable and can become increasingly life-giving and community creating if we work through that discomfort. Next slide. It's tempting, I don't know about others, I know for myself, when I see somebody else who's hurting, I want to be a kind of a rescuer or a savior of that. But that, as I understand the experience in my journey with other people in my life, people of color and other people who are white, I understand that what we're being invited to is to become continually allies or companions in the struggle. It's not like we arrive, it's a continual process. Next slide. And doing so, I keep coming back to this, doing that kind of ally work of accompanying in the struggle becomes increasingly uncomfortable. But doing so will increasingly yield life-giving and community-creating results. Next slide. The Chancellor said this: as institutions of higher learning, we fully support freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the right to peacefully protest, as well as to advocate for social change. Those are values and processes that we as an educational institution hold up and strive for. Next slide. But I would go back to that quote that Pastor James referenced earlier. This isn't just about intellectual activity, and it isn't about just being against something. It's about being something for something that is a light in this world. It's about being something for a healing spirit that's more powerful than that suffering and that pain. And we are, while we're ordinary people, we can hear the invitation, the call of that light and that spirit. And we can say yes and respond in extraordinary ways.